everyone, welcome back to Let's Talk. My name is John, and today here on the channel, we're going to be counting down the top 10 80s films that are on 4K Blu-ray that you must have in your collection. And this isn't necessarily my top 10 favorite films of the 1980s, or even the top 10 films of the 1980s. These are just the movies that came out in the 1980s that have 4K Blu-ray releases, and they got to be quality 4K Blu-ray releases. So we're not going to be talking about planes, trains, and automobiles, because if this was my top 10 favorite films of the 80s, that movie would make that list, but it will not make my top 10 4K Blu-ray list, because Planes, Trains, and Automobiles 4K Blu-ray, it's not a good one, and it has no right being on this list, despite being a great film. So hopefully one day Paramount gives us a new one of those. And I also only picked one film from one director, so even though John Carpenter had a lot of movies come to 4K Blu-ray, and a lot of his best films came out in the 1980s, you're only going to see one John Carpenter film, what I believe is the definitive 4K Blu-ray that's come out from his filmography. And you're also going to see only one film from each franchise, just so we don't overlap on a bunch of stuff, because if we include entire collections, I think that would be cheating as well, and this way we get to spread the love around. So without further ado, let's dive into this list and start it off with number 10.
Halloween, happy, happy Halloween, silver shamrock.
And number 10 happens to be my favorite film of the Halloween franchise, Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. I know this is the outlier in the entire franchise. This is the one that doesn't feature Michael Myers in it. People are still upset to this day that this movie doesn't feature Michael Myers, and I blame them for naming this movie Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, given the original idea for the Halloween franchise from Deborah Hill and John Carpenter was to make this an anthology series where each movie took place around the holiday of Halloween. Didn't necessarily intend it to be a Michael Myers slasher franchise, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you look at it. That's how it ended up. I kind of look at it as a mixed bag. We've gotten some bad Halloween films, and we've also gotten some really good Halloween films. But to me, Halloween 3, Season of the Witch is the best of the best. I enjoy it more than the original one. Obviously, 1978's Halloween is a better movie. It's John Carpenter's classic. It's really the one that put the slasher genre on the map. Not going to sell that one short. But Scream Factory gave us the entire franchise on 4K Blu-ray, well, the entire franchise up to Rob Zombie. So all the way up to Halloween Resurrection, which is probably the worst in the franchise, or Halloween Ends in my opinion. But they also gave us Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, and this is a beautiful 4K Blu-ray. What an incredible transfer. The colors just pop off the screen now. It's a much, much improved version of the previous Blu-ray, which Shout and Scream Factory did actually give us a really nice collection of as well, but they gave us all the bells and whistles in the packaging here. It's got good audio, and man, the transfer is just beautiful. And I understand if people don't really like this movie, but you cannot deny the quality of this 4K transfer from Scream Factory. And then at number 9, we got 1982's Poltergeist. In a lot of ways, this is my favorite horror film of all time. It is one of my favorite films of the 1980s. If Steven Spielberg actually directed this movie like he's rumored to have directed this film, not Tobe Hooper, we know that Steven Spielberg at the very least was co-directing this movie. Or at least, standing behind Tobe Hooper as he was directing the movie. But if Steven Spielberg actually did direct Poltergeist, Poltergeist would be my favorite Steven Spielberg movie. I think this movie's an absolute masterpiece. So when this originally got announced for a 4K Blu-ray back in 2022 from Warner Brothers, this was an immediate pre-order for me, and thankfully, it was a fantastic transfer. I just rewatched this, a few months ago. Still holds up, still a great transfer, and they also gave us this really nice steelbook, which I absolutely love, which actually has a warning in there in case you do have epilepsy, because there are some flashing lights in this movie. I do appreciate that. Thought that was pretty cool. That's why I kept it in there. I didn't throw it out. Thought that was a nice little thing that they did. I always appreciate when they do things for accessibility for people with disabilities. I really do think that's important. So, a little minor rant there, but I do think that's pretty cool. And, we got the 2 discs in there. Again, great art design on the steelbook. The original slipcover version is also really nice, but the transfer itself is fantastic. It's beautiful looking. A movie from 1982 that's now 42 years old. Looks absolutely stunning on your screen. They did a great job in the transfer. I was very afraid with this one. I thought they were going to half-ass it, but Warner Brothers really has it down pat when it comes to their 4K transfers.
Santa's on his way. Hip, hip, hooray for Christmas vacation.
And speaking of Warner Brothers, we're going to include the best vacation film. No, not the original. We're going to be talking about Christmas Vacation, the 1989 classic that stars Chevy Chase, Beverly D'Angelo, Randy Quaid. I mean, for me, this is just a Christmas staple. I watched this 4K Blu-ray twice last Christmas season, and I've already watched this 4K Blu-ray 4 times. It's only been out for about a year and a couple months now, but it's an amazing transfer, and the film itself is fantastic. I really do think that this is the kind of movie that captured what Christmas is really like when you're staying at home with your family family. I think they nailed that. You know, it's called Christmas Vacation, but it's really everybody taking a vacation to their house. The jokes are just coming at you a mile a minute. It's absolutely hysterical. And again, Warner Brothers did a fantastic job on all of the Christmas transfers that came out that year. You had Elf, A Christmas Story, and The Polar Express. All four of them were perfect transfers. I mean, really 10 out of 10 visuals. The audio was also really good. I think Christmas Vacation was the best of all of those Christmas transfers, despite Christmas Story being really good as well. Elf, I mean, it's a huge upgrade. It's honestly a very, very, very noticeable upgrade. But Christmas Vacation, I think, is overall the better film, so I gave the slight edge to Christmas Vacation. Plus, I mean, those jokes. This movie is so funny. It really showed that even though Chevy Chase can be an asshole on set, he's still a funny guy, and you really can't deny that even with a movie like this. One that won the John Carpenter sweepstakes for me is 1982's The Thing. We just talked about Poltergeist not too long ago. This came out in June of 1982, just like Poltergeist, which is probably a bad thing for this movie because this really got buried at the box office. In June of 1982, not only did you get Poltergeist in this film, but you also got Wrath of Khan, E.T., and Blade Runner. Actually, we'll talk about Blade Runner in a little while, but it's really incredible that month of June of 1982. If you were around then, it must have just been like eating candy every single day for dinner, or cookies, or whatever, just really stuffing your face with something you absolutely love. I could not imagine, especially if you were a sci-fi fan. It just must have been incredible. I wish I was around in the summer of 1982 for that one, and just to see The Thing on the big screen. But people really did bury The Thing. It didn't make money. Critics were really hard on it, just like they were really hard on a lot of John Carpenter movies in the 1980s. For some reason, all of his movies, to the point that when Big Trouble in Little China came out and that bombed at the box office, he took a break from filmmaking, especially working with big studios. He really just had that bad taste in his mouth, and it's a real shame because John Carpenter is probably one of my top 5 favorite directors of all time. I enjoy almost all of his films, and The Thing for me is the best of his films, and thank God we got a fantastic transfer here. Universal, for the most part, gives us good transfers. The problem with Universal is they usually don't hit those 10 out of 10 visuals, but they never also drop down to like that 6 or 5 out of 10 visuals. They're always like operating in the sweet spot, but I think The Thing is actually a fantastic 4K Blu-ray. I remember the reviews at the time kind of being a little hard on this one, but every time I revisit it, I don't know what they were seeing. I really think this is a great 4K Blu-ray, a fantastic transfer. The audio itself is also really good. The only thing I could say that's a negative about this 4K Blu-ray is the extras, which, you know, I have that complaint a lot, but we're not really necessarily here to talk about all of the extras or anything like that. But I just remember being a little bit upset with The Thing 4K Blu-ray and its extras, so that's really the only flaw of it. But if I was going to pick a favorite John Carpenter 4K Blu-ray, it's absolutely going to be The Thing. It's a great transfer, and a great film like this absolutely deserved that.
Time to die.
And we're going to go right back to June of 1982 with Blade Runner. This is arguably Ridley Scott's best film. For me, it's either this or Alien. I really go back and forth on it. My gut always says to go with Blade Runner, mainly because I'm a bigger sci-fi fan than I am a horror fan, but you could argue that Alien is also a sci-fi horror film, leaning more on the horror film. It's basically Halloween in space is how a lot of people have described it. I think that's casting a too broad of a blanket over Alien. Alien has a lot to say, whether it be about blue-collar workers. It also has a huge allegory for sex in there for Alien. Alien has a lot more themes and metaphors in there than you actually realize. And if you want to talk about the themes and metaphors, we go in the Blade Runner, a straightforward sci-fi movie. Now, this movie was pitched to me as an action sci-fi movie, and that's not what this movie is. There are some action sequences in this, but it's a very thought-provoking, beautiful-looking film with probably my second favorite score of all time. You know, every time I watch this movie, I get enthralled in it. I get wrapped up in the story despite seeing it so many different times. Maybe that's because there's so many different cuts of this film, but this 4K Blu-ray happens to be the final cut of the film, which I think is the definitive cut of the film. I know a lot of people like the original cut with Harrison Ford's narration. I don't mind that one. I know a lot of people also hate that one because Harrison Ford clearly half-assed the narration.
They don't advertise for killers in a newspaper. That was my profession. Ex-cop, ex-Blade Runner.
You know, it's Harrison Ford. He's a grumpy man. We get that, and I can still appreciate that. But the problem was studios did not trust their viewers, and I really think that's a fault on them because this movie didn't need the narration. You understand the story very well while watching it without it. It wasn't necessary, so I do think the final cut is the definitive edition. Also, this movie, again, shot and just looks beautiful, whether it be with miniatures, matte paintings, practical effects. It's all done stunningly in this movie. They created a future Los Angeles, and it deserved a great 4K Blu-ray. This would be number one. It is a Warner Brothers 4K Blu-ray that came out in the early days of 4K, and I just rewatched this pretty recently, and it's starting to show its age where we can probably tweak it a little bit and make it just look a little bit better. And the only reason I say that is because Blade Runner is one of the most important films of all time, and its visuals and its audio design are stunning. So just imagine an upgraded version of this on 4K Blu-ray. I would have no problem double dipping if they came out with it. If they decided they wanted to redo the transfer, I would absolutely have no issue with it. Blade Runner is still one of my favorite films of all time. And thankfully, this 4K Blu-ray, despite me saying I have some minor issues with it now, it is still one of the top 10 4K Blu-rays you have to own in your collection from the 1980s.
I'm late for school.
And now we're getting into the top 5, and starting it off is Back to the Future. I have the entire collection here from Universal, but we're only going to be talking about what I think is the best film in the Back to the Future trilogy. And I think most people would agree with me. The original Back to the Future, that is one of the best films of the 1980s. I know so many people, including David, aka Shamrock Balls, said this is one of his top 10, if not top 5 films of all time. And you know what? Back to the Future is one of the best films of all time. The screenplay is excellent. The acting is excellent. The score is just excellent. The visuals are stunning, and bringing it to 4K Blu-ray, I have almost no flaws. I just talked about how Universal sometimes doesn't hit those 10 out of 10 visuals. Well, they did with Back to the Future. It looks absolutely gorgeous. The sequels in this set both look great as well, but the original film, the quality of the film itself, it's one that you have to have in your collection. I was actually very against getting this 4K Blu-ray collection at the very beginning because I had just picked up the Blu-ray collection and I was in protest of this one, and man, I was so wrong about that. This is one of the best looking 4K Blu-rays out there. The audio design, again, is fantastic as well. And we're talking about Back to the Future here. We're talking about Marty McFly, Doc Brown. These guys are a staple of so many people's childhood, and you owe it to yourself, especially if you're a 4K Blu-ray collector, to actually have Back to the Future in your collection.
You know, sharing your adventures is an interesting experience.
And we're going back to another box set at number 4, and we're going to pull out of the Indiana Jones 4K Blu-ray collection. We're going back to 1989 with The Last Crusade. This is the third film in the Indiana Jones franchise. Most people would probably say Raiders of the Lost Ark is the best of the franchise. David, aka Shamrock Balls, would say Temple of Doom is the best in the franchise, but for me, Last Crusade is the best in the franchise. Now, you could argue, and I'll even say it's true, that this is a retread of Raiders of the Lost Ark. They took a lot of their risks with Temple of Doom, and they decided to get back to form. Spielberg wasn't happy with how things were going in his personal life when he made Temple of Doom, and you feel like he swung and missed on that one. Now, I don't think he did. I think Temple of Doom is fantastic. It's a great middle chapter in any trilogy. I would say in even most trilogies, the middle chapter is always the darker of any of the films, and Temple of Doom just happens to be a prequel, so maybe they don't feel like it's a regular old-fashioned middle chapter where it's trying to get us to Last Crusade, because you can watch any Indiana Jones film on its own. It's really just telling an episode of a long-running serial, which is exactly what George Lucas and Steven Spielberg were going for, so you can pick up any which one. So if you're not even a fan of the Indiana Jones franchise, like my wife isn't, and you could just turn on The Last Crusade and get everything you need to know. We get a great prologue in this, having a young River Phoenix play the young Indiana Jones. That has one of my favorite transitions when we transition to Harrison Ford, now Indiana Jones, looking up with that hat on the boat with the rain coming down on him. One of my favorite shots in film history. And then I just love the relationship between Sean Connery and Harrison Ford as father and son. I think they had great chemistry, and I think this movie is just fantastic. I absolutely love Last Crusade. And then the 4K, again, these are some must-own 4K Blu-rays, all 4 of them, even Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Even if you just had to get one and you could buy them individually, whether it be in just regular old-fashioned 4K Blu-ray without the bells or whistles, or you could even get a better version of this steelbook, which I do recommend. I'm not a big fan of white being the base color on these 4K Blu-rays. I just never thought of white as Indiana Jones. If anything, if they would have switched it to black or that burnt orange, I think it would have worked a little bit better. So I do have some complaint about the artwork on these, but the transfers themselves are fantastic. And also you get great audio. This has some of the best audio, and for a film that really deserves it with that great John Williams score and those over-the-top sound effects, The Last Crusade absolutely deserved a great 4K Blu-ray. And thankfully, Paramount did not hold back. They gave us all the bells and whistles. These are 10 out of 10 4K Blu-rays, but for me, if you can only get one, Last Crusade is the one to get.
Your credit's fine, Mr. Torrance. That's swell. I like you, Lloyd. I always liked you.
And moving on to number 3, which is actually widely considered one of the best 4K Blu-rays out there, and I actually happen to have the 4K steelbook of it because it's just absolutely gorgeous, is The Shining. And when you come inside, you also get 2 discs. You get a 4K Blu-ray and a Blu-ray disc, and I just absolutely love this. The actual Slipcover version is really nice as well. I just felt like the artwork itself did not fit in with the actual film. It's the only reason why I actually went with the steelbook version over the slipcover version. Not the biggest steelbook guy. I just really go with my gut, whichever one looks best to me. But if the slipcover version had looked like this, I probably would have gone slipcover. But what can I say about The Shining? It's one of Stanley Kubrick's many masterpieces. Released in 1980, stars Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance. Him and his family, they're spending the winter taking care of the Overlook Hotel. And what do you know? This happens not just to be a haunted house, but an entire haunted hotel. And you're being locked in there with a man who has a serious alcohol addiction.
Here's to 5 miserable months on the wagon.
And it's just the three of you? Well, things can get bad pretty fast, and they do. And thankfully, Warner Brothers gave us an amazing transfer for that. And honestly, all of Stanley Kubrick's films that have been brought to 4K Blu-ray, Clockwork Orange, Full Metal Jacket, Paths of Glory, we've gotten The Killing, we've gotten really spoiled with Stanley Kubrick films on 4K Blu-ray. Forgot probably the best of them, 2001: A Space Odyssey, but we're talking 80s 4K Blu-rays here. So The Shining just got in there in 1980, and it does kind of feel like what I like to call a hangover film from the 1970s. It moves along more at a 1970s pace than the 1980s pace. You know, every time we switch decades, from the 70s to the 80s, we kind of have movies from the early part of the decade, or just really in pop culture in general, still feeling like the 1970s. It's more noticeable when we go from the 1980s to the 1990s. When people think of the 1990s, they think of grunge music, you know, dark colors, darker music, darker films. But if you really think about it, in 1990, 1991, and even into 1992, hair metal was still all over the place. If you look at a 1991 film, it probably feels like a 1980s film more than anything. And that's just because, you know what, we're still just getting into the groove of what the 1990s would be. I would say things kind of changed once we got to the summer of 1991 with Terminator 2 and Point Break. Those feel like 90s movies, but movies from 1990, a lot of them do still feel like the 1980s. And I think The Shining is one of those 1970s hangover movies, but it's a perfect film. It's a 10 out of 10 movie. And that 4K Blu-ray, mwah, chef's kiss of beauty, man. Love that movie. One of my favorite horror films of all time. I just feel like I can't add to what everybody else already said about The Shining. It is one of those must-own horror films. If you're a 4K Blu-ray collector, not only is that a fantastic movie, but it's also a fantastic 4K Blu-ray. You owe it to yourself to have it in the collection.
Your move, creep.
And I went back and forth on what I would do with number 2 and number 1, because arguably my number 2 is a much better film, and it's probably one I like slightly more than my number 1, but I have to go with my gut on this one and go with RoboCop at number 2. This is the Arrow Video 4K Blu-ray release from them, because I'm actually going to do a re-review of the entire collection here on the channel, because we did the review of this in the very early days of the channel. I'm not too happy with it, and I think RoboCop, a film like this, which I absolutely love, and if you are a fan of this like I am, you need to get that RoboDoc documentary that came out last year. It is fantastic. It leaves no stone unturned when it comes to RoboCop. If you're a fan of RoboCop, the first film, they don't actually go into the sequels, which is fine with me, but apparently they might make similar RoboDocs about 2 and 3, and I'd be alright with that, even if I don't really like 2 and 3 that much. And the remake, my god, don't go near that. That movie is atrocious. But when it comes to the original RoboCop, this is an absolute Paul Verhoeven classic. It's got the satire, it's got the over-the-top 80s action, that iconic score. It's just a perfect film with a perfect screenplay, and thankfully, this is what I hope they do with Terminator. That's why I want Arrow Video to get a hold of this, and you know what? They're both Orion Pictures. Even the first RoboCop trailer used the Terminator score, mainly because, hey, it's Orion Pictures and we have access to it. But they just gave us all the bells and whistles, so many different extras. Of course, now the best documentary is the RoboDoc documentary, but there's still some great extras on here as well. They gave us reading material, the hard Arrow Video casing. This is exactly what you want if you're a fan of a film. You want them to give you everything you could ever imagine. They gave us this and True Romance Arrow Video, which are 2 of my favorite films of all time. So Arrow Video has spoiled me. That's why I want them to be the studio that gets their hands on the Terminator, and this has to be the year for Terminator. We're talking 40 years since the greatest film was released, and I don't want to overshadow RoboCop, because RoboCop is also one of the greatest films ever made. They really set the precedent of what can be a great 4K Blu-ray when it comes to great 1980s films. You even put the OCP logo right on the back. That is just perfect. My god, I can go on and on about this one. It'll get its own review again one day.
When he's around, anything can happen.
How does a guy like you end up a bouncer?
Just lucky, I guess.
Which, of course, now brings us to number one, and it actually happens to be pretty timely because they actually just released the poster for the remake of this film, and we're talking about Roadhouse, starring Patrick Swayze, and probably, I mean, it's not his most famous role, it's up there. I would say he has probably he has 4 very famous roles that he's known for. Dirty Dancing, Roadhouse, Ghost, and Point Break. So Patrick Swayze all over pop culture in the late 80s and early 90s. And no one's going to say that Patrick Swayze is the best actor. Nobody's going to say that this is the best movie. But what movie illustrates the 1980s, over-the-top 80s cheese, cocaine 80s more than Roadhouse? I can't think of one. The plot of this movie is absolutely ridiculous. It's basically just a modern-day Western. A town's being overrun by crooks and criminals. It's got one big guy who's somehow in charge of the whole town without police interference, and they need to bring in a bouncer to get the double deuce in order. But not only is he going to save the club, he's also going to save the entire town, because that's the kind of guy he is. They don't realize who they're messing with. They're messing with Dalton. And you know what? They gave us everything in this 4K Blu-ray. There's a full 4K Blu-ray review of this here on the channel, but this is probably my top 5 favorite pieces that I have in my collection. I cannot believe that we got this for Roadhouse. This is what I hope Vinegar Syndrome does with all of their releases. Obviously, that's just absolutely impossible, but when you get a big film like Roadhouse to give us this beautiful collection, it is the #1 4K Blu-ray from the 1980s you have to have in your collection. It's going to be hard to top this one. If you can get it in this beautiful collector's edition, I recommend it, but if you can only get it in that standard edition with just the discs itself, it's still great. The extras on this are incredible. You even get a Kevin Smith commentary track on there, which I love. So you know what? They really gave us everything. So many extras spread across so many different discs. A great audio track. I mean, this is a 10 out of 10 any which way you spin it. You have to have it in your collection. I highly, highly, highly recommend it, and I promise you, you will not be disappointed by it. And I do have a few honorable mentions before I get out of here today. Shout Select's release of Streets of Fire is a really, really good one that I absolutely love. And I want to go back to John Carpenter. You can talk a little bit about Scream Factory's release of Escape from New York, and if you live in a different region, you also got it from Studio Canal. Studio Canal did the transfer of that, and that is another beautiful transfer that they did, and I think that's just one of the best looking versions of Escape from New York. They also did Escape from LA, which is a very underrated 1990s movie, but we're here talking 1980s 4K Blu-rays. And Arrow Video also gave us Witness on 4K Blu-ray, which is a fantastic one as well. Scream Factory gave us pretty recently The Dead Zone on 4K Blu-ray, which I think has some of the best visuals and is one of the biggest upgrades I've ever seen visually. I just know a lot of people don't seem to care too much about that movie. I think that's one of David Cronenberg's best movies, maybe because it doesn't fit the usual David Cronenberg mold, especially for 1980s Cronenberg. That feels like more of a straightforward sci-fi horror drama, kind of a mix of a film where, you know, we think David Cronenberg, we think body horror. Speaking of which, we've also gotten Videodrome from the Criterion Collection on 4K Blu-ray, which looks absolutely gorgeous as well, which in another region you can find out on Arrow Video. It should be the same exact scan. So we've gotten some great films from the 1980s on 4K Blu-ray, but we've also got some swings and misses with movies like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. That's just a really bad transfer. I also think Weird Science is not one of the greatest transfers. Despite loving that film, I don't think the 4K Blu-ray is a huge upgrade over the previously released Blu-ray. But those are my honorable mentions, guys, and I want to hear from you guys. What are some 1980s films that you love that I must have in my 4K Blu-ray collection? Let me know in the comment section below, and while you guys are down there, don't forget to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, turn notifications on, and if you want to take your support of Let's Talk to the next level, we have channel memberships in 3 different tiers. You can become a friend of the channel, you can become a channel producer like Nocturnal, Jason Martin, Mr. Smelly Potato, and John Doe Juggalo. Or you can even become a channel director like Frank's Media and Reviews, and he has a YouTube channel as well. Check him out. He's a big physical media supporter, been a supporter of this channel since the early days of the channel, so he's a great guy. Check his channel out as well. And after you're done doing all of that, don't forget to tell your friends about us, and then after that, we'll be seeing you around.